The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floor of Dr. Sarah Thompson's corner office. At 42 years old, she had become one of the most respected names in pharmaceutical development. Her dark fingers moved swiftly across her laptop's keyboard as she finished the last details for today's important presentation. In just a few hours, she would be flying to Boston for what could be the biggest merger in her company's history. Sarah closed her laptop and stood up, smoothing her navy blue blazer. The designer outfit had been carefully chosen for this meeting, professional, powerful, and worth every penny of its high price tag. She had learned early in her career that appearance mattered, especially for a black woman in the corporate world. Her natural hair was styled in a neat, professional crown, and her minimal jewelry spoke of quiet confidence rather than flash. Looking out of her office window at the San Francisco skyline, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. 15 years ago, she had started as a junior researcher, fresh out of medical school with big dreams and bigger student loans. Now, she was executive vice president of drug development at PharmaGlobe, with over 200 employees under her leadership and 3 life-saving drugs in the market bearing her research team's signature. Her assistant, Tom, knocked on the doorframe. "Dr. Thompson, your car is waiting downstairs." "Thank you, Tom." Sarah gathered her briefcase and carry-on bag. "Remember to send those trial reports to the FDA by noon." "Already done," Tom replied with a grin. "And I've double-checked your flight details. The private jet is fueled and ready at Terminal 3. Weather looks clear all the way to Boston." As Sarah walked through the office, heads turned and people smiled. She had earned their respect through years of brilliant work and fair leadership. Under her guidance, the research department had flourished, with employee satisfaction rates at an all-time high. She made sure to thank each person who wished her luck with the merger meeting. In the elevator, Sarah checked her phone one last time. There was a message from her daughter Lisa, a sophomore at Stanford. "Knock him dead, Mom." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. Lisa was following in her footsteps, majoring in biochemistry with dreams of her own about changing the world through science. The company car waited outside, its black exterior gleaming in the morning light. The driver, Marcus, held the door open with a warm smile. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson. Terminal 3 today?" "Yes, Marcus, and please, after 5 years of driving me around, you can call me Sarah." Marcus chuckled as he closed her door. "Company policy, Dr. Thompson, but I appreciate the offer." During the drive to the airport, Sarah reviewed her presentation one final time. The merger would combine PharmaGlobe's research expertise with Boston Biotech's manufacturing capabilities. If successful, it would mean faster development times for new drugs and better access to life-saving medications for millions of people. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. James Chen, the pilot who would be flying her to Boston today. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson. We're all set for an on-time departure. Clear skies ahead." Sarah appreciated James's professionalism. She had flown with him several times over the past year, and he always made sure everything ran smoothly. In her position, time was literally money, and private flights had become a necessary tool rather than a luxury. The car pulled up to Terminal 3, where private jets waited on the tarmac like expensive toys. Sarah gathered her things, thanked Marcus, and stepped out into the bright morning air. Her heels clicked confidently on the pavement as she walked toward the terminal entrance. She had made this walk dozens of times before, but today felt different, more important. A group of businessmen exited the terminal, nodding respectfully as they passed. They knew who she was. In the pharmaceutical industry, everyone knew Dr. Sarah Thompson. A reputation preceded her. Brilliant scientist, tough negotiator, fair leader. The patents under her name had earned billions for PharmaGlobe while making essential medications more accessible to developing nations. Sarah reached for her ID and flight documents, already anticipating the quick security check that would lead her to her waiting jet. The morning sun felt warm on her face, and she took a deep breath of the crisp air. In just a few hours, she would be presenting to a boardroom full of executives, potentially changing the future of both companies. But for now, she was simply a woman walking into an airport, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did she know that the biggest challenge of her career wasn't waiting for her in that Boston boardroom. It was waiting just inside those terminal doors. As Sarah approached the terminal entrance, she noticed a new security guard standing at the door. Ron Mitchell had worked at the private aviation terminal for only 3 months, but he had already developed a reputation among some staff for his selective enforcement of security protocols. Today, he stood with his feet planted firmly apart, his hand resting near his security badge as he watched people enter. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as Sarah walked toward the door. Before she could reach for the handle, he stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path. His 6'2" frame towered over her 5'6" height as he looked down at her with obvious suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the word "ma'am" in a way that made it sound like an insult. "This is a private aviation terminal. I'm going to need to see some identification." Sarah maintained her professional composure, having dealt with similar situations before. She reached into her designer bag and produced both her driver's license and her flight documentation. "Of course, I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson. I have a flight scheduled for 9:30 a.m. to Boston." Mitchell barely glanced at the documents. "Yeah, right. Look, this terminal is for private jet passengers only. The main terminal is that way." He pointed toward the commercial airport building in the distance. "Sir, if you'll actually look at my documentation, you'll see that I'm scheduled for a private flight. I'm the executive vice president of PharmaGlobe, and I fly from this terminal regularly." Sarah's voice remained steady, but she felt her heart rate increasing. Just then, a group of white executives walked up to the door. Mitchell stepped aside immediately, giving them a friendly nod as they passed through without any document check. Sarah noticed this and discreetly pulled out her phone, letting it record in her pocket. "Listen here," Mitchell said, turning back to her with growing hostility. "I don't care what kind of papers you're showing me. I know every regular passenger who comes through here, and you're not one of them. Now, I'm asking you nicely to leave before I have to call the police for trespassing." Sarah stood her ground, years of boardroom negotiations having taught her how to handle hostile situations. "Sir, I want to speak to your supervisor immediately. Your treatment of me is discriminatory, and I will not be intimidated." Mitchell's face reddened. "Discriminatory? I'm doing my job. You people always play that card when you don't get your way. I'm protecting this facility from unauthorized access." By now, several people had stopped to watch the confrontation. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. Sarah could hear whispers and saw looks of concern and disgust directed at Mitchell's behavior. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, reading his name tag. "I'll say this one more time. I am Dr. Sarah Thompson, Executive VP of PharmaGlobe. This is my flight documentation showing my scheduled departure. Your selective enforcement of security protocols based on race is not only unprofessional but illegal." Mitchell reached for his radio, his hand shaking with anger. "That's it. I'm calling security backup and the police. You're creating a disturbance." A well-dressed woman who had passed through earlier approached them. "Excuse me, but I've flown with Dr. Thompson before. She's exactly who she says she is. What you're doing is absolutely shameful." Mitchell ignored the woman, speaking into his radio. "I need backup at the main entrance. We have an unauthorized individual refusing to leave the premises." Sarah remained perfectly still, her phone still recording in her pocket. She had faced discrimination before, but never quite this blatant. She thought about Lisa, her daughter, and how she had always taught her to stand up against injustice with dignity and strength. More passengers gathered around, many of them regular clients who recognized Sarah. The whispers grew louder, and several people were openly filming now. Mitchell's face grew redder as he realized he might have made a serious mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "The police are on their way," he announced, trying to sound authoritative despite his increasingly uncertain expression. "Everyone needs to step back and give us space." Sarah calmly took out her phone, now openly recording. "That's fine. I'm sure they'll be very interested in reviewing this footage, along with your supervisor and my company's legal team." The situation had reached a boiling point. Mitchell stood rigid, locking the door like it was his last stand, while Sarah remained composed, knowing that every second of this interaction was being documented. The morning sun that had felt so warm and promising earlier now beat down on them like a spotlight, illuminating a scene that would soon change both their lives forever. The crowd around Sarah and Mitchell grew larger, their phones recording every moment of the confrontation. The morning sun that had once felt pleasant now beat down mercilessly, making the situation even more uncomfortable. Sarah could feel sweat forming on her back beneath her expensive blazer, but she refused to show any sign of discomfort. Two more security guards arrived, responding to Mitchell's call. They approached cautiously, taking in the scene, their colleague blocking the door, the crowd of well-dressed executives filming with their phones, and Sarah standing calmly with her documents in hand. The growing audience included pilots, flight attendants, and other aviation staff who had stopped their work to watch. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked one of the new guards, a younger man named Peterson, according to his badge. Before Sarah could speak, Mitchell jumped in. "This woman is trying to gain unauthorized access to the private terminal. She's refusing to leave and causing a disturbance." "I'd shown him my valid ID and flight documentation," Sarah replied evenly, her voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "He has refused to even look at them properly, while allowing other passengers to enter without any verification at all." She held up her phone. "I had the entire interaction recorded." A flight attendant from another private jet stepped forward. "This is ridiculous. That's Dr. Thompson. She flies through here at least twice a month." Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, and more voices joined in supporting Sarah. Mitchell's face grew even redder. "Everyone just wants to make this about race. I'm doing my job, protecting this facility from people who don't belong here." His words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several people in the crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "Did he really just say that?" Another person called out, "Someone send this video to the news." Sarah felt her chest tighten with a familiar pain, the kind that came from years of facing such prejudice, no matter how successful she became. But she had long ago learned to transform that pain into strength. She straightened her spine, standing even taller. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and controlled, "I'd like you to explain exactly who you think doesn't belong here. Because I've been flying from this terminal for 5 years, managing critical business operations for a Fortune 500 company. I hold 3 patents, have a medical degree from Johns Hopkins, and lead a team of over 200 people. So please, enlighten us all about who belongs where." The younger guard, Peterson, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He stepped forward to examine the documents Sarah was still holding. After a quick review, his eyes widened. "Sir," he said to Mitchell, "these credentials are completely valid. Dr. Thompson is indeed scheduled for the 9:30 flight to Boston." Mitchell refused to back down. "Well, how do we know these aren't fake? Anyone can print up some documents." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it while keeping her phone camera steady. It was from her daughter Lisa. "Mom, you okay? Someone just posted a video of this on social media. It's already getting shared like crazy. Don't let them intimidate you." The humiliation of the situation struck Sarah anew. Her daughter was watching this unfold online. Her colleagues, clients, and countless strangers would see this video. But instead of shame, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. The terminal manager finally emerged from his office, hurrying toward the scene with a look of alarm on his face. "What in God's name is going on out here? Your security guard is refusing to let me enter the terminal despite valid documentation," Sarah explained calmly. "He has made several discriminatory remarks, all of which have been recorded by multiple witnesses." The crowd parted as another familiar face approached. Captain Michael Chen, Sarah's pilot for the day. Its expression was a mixture of concern and controlled anger as he took in the scene before him. The same guard who was now questioning Sarah's right to be there had waved him through with barely a glance just 30 minutes earlier. The morning that had started with such promise had turned into a public spectacle of prejudice and humiliation. But as Sarah stood her ground, surrounded by a mix of supporters and cameras, she knew this moment would have consequences far beyond this terminal door. Captain Michael Chen moved through the crowd with purpose, his pilot's uniform crisp and his authority evident in every step. He had been preparing the flight plan when a ground crew member rushed in to tell him about the commotion at the entrance. Now, seeing Sarah Thompson, one of his most respected passengers, being treated this way, his usual calm demeanor gave way to controlled anger. "What's the meaning of this?" Captain Chen's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He stood beside Sarah, his presence adding another layer of authority to the situation. "Dr. Thompson is a regular passenger and a valued client." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, but tried to maintain his stance. Sir, I'm just following security protocols. No, you're not, Chen interrupted, his voice firm. I've been flying Dr. Thompson on this route for over a year. She has the highest security clearance for private aviation. I watched you wave through 6 other passengers without checking any documentation, but you stopped Dr. Thompson. The terminal manager, Mr. Roberts, looked increasingly distressed. Captain Chen, I assure you we'll get this sorted out immediately. It should never have happened in the first place, Chen replied. He turned to Mitchell. I was here 30 minutes ago when you let me through with just a nod. No ID check. No questions. Why is that, Mr. Mitchell? Mitchell's face flushed deeper. That's different. You're wearing a uniform, and I recognize you. And you should recognize Dr. Thompson, too. Chen cut in. She flies through here twice a month minimum, unless you're selectively choosing who to remember. Sarah watched the exchange, still recording everything on her phone. She noticed how other pilots and flight crew members had gathered around, many nodding in agreement with Captain Chen's words. Some were openly filming the confrontation on their phones. The young security guard, Peterson, stepped forward again. Captain Chen is right. I just checked the frequent flyer logs. Dr. Thompson has been through this terminal 26 times in the past year alone. Mitchell began to look cornered. His earlier confidence wavered as he realized the seriousness of his situation. I was just trying to be thorough. Thorough? Chen's voice carried a sharp edge. Let's review what thorough means. In the past 15 minutes, you've refused to properly check Dr. Thompson's valid documentation, threatened to call the police on a legitimate passenger, made several discriminatory remarks that were caught on camera, and delayed an executive's scheduled flight without cause. The terminal manager wiped sweat from his forehead. Dr. Thompson, please accept our deepest apologies. Mr. Mitchell, step aside and report to my office immediately. But Captain Chen wasn't finished. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal entrance. I've been flying for 23 years. In that time, I've seen how private aviation can sometimes be an exclusive club. But let me be clear, that exclusivity should be about the price of the ticket, not the color of someone's skin. Several people in the crowd applauded. Sarah noticed some of the airline staff wiping tears from their eyes. Even the young guard Peterson was nodding in agreement. Dr. Thompson, Chen continued, turning to her with professional courtesy, your aircraft is ready, and we're still on schedule if you'd like to board now, unless you prefer to file a formal complaint first. Sarah looked at her watch, considering her options. The merger meeting in Boston was important, but so was addressing this situation. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with another message. It was from the CDO of PharmaGlobe. Just saw the videos. Take whatever time you need. Meeting will wait. Handle this situation as you see fit. You have our full support. Mitchell stood to the side, his security badge now clutched in his trembling hand. The terminal manager was already on his phone, likely calling the security company's head office. The crowd continued to record everything, their phones capturing every moment of this turning point in private aviation history. Captain Chen stood respectfully beside Sarah, waiting for her decision. His intervention had transformed the situation from a solo stand against discrimination into a moment of collective accountability. The morning sun now streamed through the terminal windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where change was unfolding in real time. Sarah took a deep breath, ready to make her decision about what should happen next. The humiliation of earlier had been replaced by a sense of purpose. Sometimes, she realized, being delayed for the right reasons was more important than being on time. The terminal's security office was quiet except for the soft whir of computers and the occasional murmur of voices. Sarah sat in a comfortable chair, her phone now connected to a computer as a technician downloaded her video of the incident. Around her, a team of aviation security officials worked quickly to gather evidence of what had happened just an hour earlier. Dr. Thompson, said Maria Rodriguez, the lead investigator from the Aviation Authority, we've already collected videos from 12 different witnesses. Would you be willing to watch some of the security camera footage with us to confirm the sequence of events? Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional composure even as the morning's events played out on the large screen before them. The security cameras had captured everything from multiple angles. In the crystal-clear footage, Mitchell's discriminatory behavior was even more obvious than it had seemed in person. "Stop there," Maria said to the technician. "Dr. Thompson, look at this timestamp. In just 15 minutes, 27 passengers entered the terminal. Mr. Mitchell only stopped one person for a document check." She didn't need to state the obvious. That person had been Sarah. Captain Chen sat nearby, having delayed the flight to Boston after getting approval from his airline. He had insisted on being present as a witness. "I've been keeping records too," he said, opening his tablet. "Over the past 3 months, I've noticed some concerning patterns with Mr. Mitchell's behavior." The captain pulled up a spreadsheet he had created. It showed dates, times, and brief descriptions of incidents he had observed. "I started documenting this when I noticed him giving extra scrutiny to passengers of color," Chen explained. "I wasn't sure if I had enough evidence to report it yet, but I knew something wasn't right." Sarah's phone buzzed again. Social media was exploding with the video of the incident. #PrivateJetWhileblack was trending, and major news networks were already reaching out for interviews. But more importantly, other passengers were coming forward with their own stories about Mitchell. "Look at this," said Peterson, the young security guard who had arrived during the confrontation. He pulled up the terminal's passenger database. "Dr. Thompson has gone through this terminal 64 times in the past 2 years. There's a photo attached to every entry. Mitchell had no excuse not to recognize her." The terminal manager, Mr. Roberts, looked increasingly distressed as he reviewed the mounting evidence. "We've also pulled Mr. Mitchell's performance reports," he said, placing a folder on the table. "There have been 3 verbal complaints about his behavior in the past month alone, but none of them were properly documented or investigated." One of the airline staff members knocked and entered with more evidence. "We found these text messages in the staff group chat," she said, handing over her phone. "Mitchell had been making inappropriate comments about passengers for weeks. Some of us tried to call him out on it, but he always played it off as jokes." The investigation team methodically documented everything. They took statements from witnesses, cataloged videos from multiple angles, and compiled a timeline of events. The evidence painted a clear picture not just of one incident, but of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. "Dr. Thompson," Maria said, turning to Sarah with a serious expression, "based on what we're seeing here, this goes beyond a single security guard's actions. There appear to be systemic issues with how discrimination complaints are handled at this facility." Sarah reviewed the growing pile of evidence on the table before her. Her own video had been just the beginning. Now, there were security camera footage files, witness statements, staff complaints, passenger records, and social media posts, all documenting not just her experience, but a larger pattern of discrimination. The young technician spoke up from his computer. "Ma'am, we've also found footage from last week showing similar incidents. Mr. Mitchell's badge swipe records show he was deliberately targeting certain passengers for extra scrutiny based on their appearance." As Sarah watched the team compile their report, she realized that her delayed flight had opened the door for something much more important. This documentation wouldn't just address one security guard's actions, it would force the entire private aviation industry to confront its problems with discrimination. "We'll have the preliminary report ready within the hour," Maria announced, organizing the files. "And Dr. Thompson, I want you to know, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of discrimination I've seen in my 15 years on the job. There's no way they can sweep this under the rug." By afternoon, the private aviation terminal's main conference room had transformed into a crisis management center. Executives from Elite Aviation Security, the company that employed Mitchell, sat around the large table with grim expressions. Their phones kept buzzing with notifications as videos of the morning's incident continued to spread across social media. James Morrison, the CEO of Elite Aviation Security, had flown in immediately after seeing the viral videos. He sat at the head of the table, his suit jacket draped over his chair, reviewing the thick folder of evidence compiled by the investigation team. "This is a complete failure on multiple levels," Morrison said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "Not just Mitchell's actions, but our entire complaint reporting system. How did we miss this pattern of behavior?" The terminal's security footage played on a large screen behind him, showing multiple instances of Mitchell's discriminatory behavior over the past 3 months. Each clip had been carefully time-stamped and annotated by the investigation team. Sarah sat across from Morrison, accompanied by both her company's legal team and Captain Chen, who had insisted on staying involved. The Boston merger meeting had been rescheduled for the following week, with the CEO's full support. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah spoke clearly, her voice steady, "what concerns me most isn't just today's incident. It's the fact that other passengers filed complaints about Mr. Mitchell's behavior, but nothing was done. Your company's failure to act enabled his discrimination to continue." The head of Human Resources, Patricia Wells, stepped forward with more documents. "We've completed our internal review," she announced, her voice shaking slightly. "We found 8 formal complaints about discriminatory behavior at this terminal in the past year. All of them were incorrectly classified as general customer service issues and never properly investigated." Morrison wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. The room's air conditioning seemed to be struggling against the heat of dozens of bodies and the warmth of embarrassment filling the space. "Dr. Thompson," Morrison leaned forward, "on behalf of Elite Aviation Security, I want to offer our deepest apologies. Mr. Mitchell has been suspended immediately, pending termination, but we recognize that's not enough." Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. "You're right. It's not enough. What's your plan to prevent this from happening to someone else?" The room fell silent as Morrison stood up and walked to a whiteboard. He began writing a list. 1. Immediate termination of Ron Mitchell. 2. Complete overhaul of complaint reporting system. 3. Mandatory bias training for all security personnel. 4. New supervision protocols. 5. Monthly review of security footage. 6. Anonymous reporting hotline. 7. Regular diversity audits. "This is just the start," Morrison said, capping the marker. "We're bringing in external consultants to review our entire operation. Every policy, every procedure, every training manual will be reviewed and updated." Sarah's phone buzzed again. The incident had now made national news. Other private aviation companies were already issuing statements about their own anti-discrimination policies, trying to distance themselves from the controversy. Patricia Wells spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "We've also discovered that our current training program is severely outdated. Some of our security personnel haven't had proper anti-bias training in over 3 years." Captain Chen, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "You need to address the culture, not just the policies. I've seen too many companies treat these incidents as PR problems rather than human rights issues." Morrison nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Captain. That's why we're establishing a permanent diversity and inclusion board with actual power to make changes. We'd like to invite both you and Dr. Thompson to be founding members, if you're willing." Sarah looked around the room, noting how the corporate response had evolved from damage control to genuine reform. The morning's humiliation had sparked what looked like real change, but she knew the real test would be in the follow-through. "One more thing," Morrison added, turning back to the whiteboard. "We're implementing a new security protocol called the Thompson Standard. It will require all passenger screenings to be documented and reviewed weekly for any signs of bias or discrimination." As the meeting continued, Sarah realized that her delayed flight had set in motion changes that would affect thousands of future passengers. Sometimes, she thought, the most important journeys aren't the ones that get you to your destination on time, but the ones that create a better path for those who follow. 3 days after the incident, Ron Mitchell sat in his apartment staring at the termination letter in his hands. The television played quietly in the background, showing yet another news report about the incident. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, but he hadn't answered any of them. The letter was clear and direct. "Following a thorough investigation of the events on April 3, 2025, Elite Aviation Security has terminated your employment effective immediately. The investigation found multiple violations of company policy, federal aviation regulations, and civil rights laws." Mitchell's hands trembled as he set down the letter. His actions hadn't just cost him his job, they had made him infamous. The videos of his confrontation with Dr. Thompson had been viewed millions of times. His face was all over the news, and social media had branded him as the racist aviation guard. Meanwhile, across town at the Elite Aviation Security headquarters, a team of diversity consultants was conducting the first day of mandatory training for all security personnel. The conference room was packed with guards, supervisors, and managers, all watching footage from the incident as part of their training. "This is what systemic discrimination looks like," the lead trainer explained, pausing the video. "It's not always obvious or dramatic. It's in the small decisions we make every day about who to stop, who to question, who to treat with suspicion." In the back of the room, Peterson, the young guard who had witnessed the incident, took careful notes. He had been promoted to lead a new security compliance team, responsible for reviewing all passenger screening procedures for potential bias. At the private aviation terminal, changes were already visible. New signs displayed a QR code for anonymous reporting of discrimination. Security cameras had been upgraded, and guards now wore body cameras. Every passenger screening was logged and reviewed, regardless of the passenger's appearance or status. Sarah's story had sparked a broader conversation in the aviation industry. Other companies began reviewing their own security procedures. The hashtag #PrivateJetWhileBlack had evolved into a movement, with more people sharing their experiences of discrimination in private aviation. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an industry-wide investigation into discriminatory security practices. They used the documentation from Sarah's case as a model for identifying patterns of bias in passenger screening. Back at his apartment, Mitchell opened his laptop to search for new jobs, but each search brought up news articles about the incident. Employers in the security industry had already blacklisted him. His certification as an aviation security officer had been suspended pending a review. His phone buzzed with a text from a former coworker. "Man, you really messed up. They're using the videos from your incident for training at every airport in the country now. You're literally becoming the example of what not to do." At Pharmavlobe's headquarters, Sarah sat in a meeting with her company's board of directors. They had fully supported her decision to address the discrimination she faced, even though it had delayed the Boston merger meeting. "Dr. Thompson," the CEO said, "your handling of this situation has done more than expose one security guard's bias. It's forcing the entire industry to confront its problems with discrimination. We're proud to have you as part of our leadership team." The consequences of that morning continued to ripple outward. Elite Aviation Security's stock price had dropped 15% after the incident. They faced multiple investigations from federal agencies and civil rights organizations. The company's leadership had been forced to acknowledge years of inadequate oversight and training. Mitchell's final paycheck arrived with another letter, this one from the Aviation Authority. They were reviewing his security credentials and considering permanent revocation. His actions had not only ended his current job but potentially his entire career in aviation security. In the evening, Sarah received an email from a young black woman studying aviation management. "Dr. Thompson, watching you stand up to discrimination gave me hope. Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept being treated differently. You changed things for all of us." The incident had lasting consequences far beyond one security guard losing his job. It had become a catalyst for change in an industry that had long struggled with issues of discrimination. Mitchell's actions, meant to exclude one person, had instead opened doors for many others. As Sarah prepared for her rescheduled flight to Boston the following week, she knew that her experience would help ensure that future passengers would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the validity of their credentials. Sometimes, she reflected, justice comes not from seeking revenge, but from ensuring that your experience helps prevent others from facing the same discrimination. 6 months after the incident, Sarah stood at a podium in the main conference hall of the National Aviation Security Summit. Behind her, a large screen displayed the new industry-wide guidelines for passenger screening that had become known as the Thompson Standards. The room was filled with executives, security personnel, and aviation authorities from across the country. "Change doesn't always come from grand plans or corporate initiatives," Sarah began, looking out at the attentive audience. "Sometimes it comes from standing your ground when someone tells you that you don't belong somewhere." In the front row, Captain Chen nodded encouragingly. He had become a key figure in implementing the new security protocols, training pilots to recognize and report discrimination. His detailed documentation of Mitchell's behavior had become a case study in how to identify patterns of bias. The changes in private aviation over the past 6 months have been remarkable. Elite Aviation Security had completely transformed its operations, setting new standards that other companies rushed to adopt. Their Thompson Standard training program had been licensed to over 50 aviation security companies nationwide. Today, I want to share some numbers with you, Sarah continued, changing the slide. In the past 6 months, reported incidents of discriminatory screening have dropped by 78% across private aviation terminals. Anonymous reporting systems have identified and addressed dozens of potential bias issues before they became serious incidents. The young security guard Peterson, now promoted to Director of Security Compliance, stood up to present the next section. His team had developed new software that analyzed security footage for patterns of discriminatory behavior, helping terminals maintain fair screening practices. But numbers only tell part of the story, Sarah said, clicking to a new slide. The real change is in the stories we don't hear, the passengers who no longer face extra scrutiny because of their appearance, the professionals who don't have to prove they belong, the travelers who are treated with respect regardless of their race. In the audience, several people nodded knowingly. The industry had been forced to confront its uncomfortable history with discrimination, and many positive changes had emerged from that reckoning. Security companies now competed on their diversity and inclusion metrics as much as their safety records. As for Ron Mitchell, his story had become a cautionary tale in security training programs nationwide. Unable to find work in aviation security, he had eventually moved to another state and taken a job as a night watchman at a warehouse. His actions had not only ended his career, but had helped transform an entire industry. Sarah clicked to her final slide, showing a photo of her daughter Lisa giving a presentation at her college about aviation security reforms. The next generation deserves better than what we accepted, Sarah said. They deserve to fly without fear of discrimination, to pursue their dreams without artificial barriers, to be judged by their credentials rather than their appearance. The changes hadn't been easy. Some companies had resisted the new standards, claiming they were too expensive or time-consuming to implement. But as data showed improved customer satisfaction and reduced liability risks, even the skeptics had come around. The PharmaGlobe merger with Boston Biotech had been successfully completed, and Sarah had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer. Her handling of the discrimination incident had demonstrated leadership qualities that went far beyond her technical expertise. After her speech, a young black pilot approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Thompson, I started my career just last month. The difference in how I'm treated now compared to when I was training 2 years ago is incredible. You changed everything for us." The summit concluded with the announcement of a new industry-wide scholarship program for minorities in aviation, named in Sarah's honor. The program would provide funding and mentorship for students pursuing careers in aviation security, piloting, and airport management. As Sarah packed up her presentation materials, she reflected on how a moment of discrimination had led to lasting change. The terminal where the incident occurred had become a model facility with diverse staff, transparent security procedures, and zero tolerance for bias. Captain Chen approached with a smile. "Ready for your flight back to San Francisco? I'm your pilot again today." Sarah smiled back. "You know what the best part is, Michael? These days, when I walk into that terminal, nobody questions whether I belong there. And it's not just me. It's everyone who comes after me, too." They walked together through the terminal, passing new signs that read "Welcome to all" in multiple languages. The security checkpoint was efficient and professional, treating each passenger with equal respect. Sarah's delayed flight 6 months ago hadn't just changed her story. It had changed the story for countless others who would follow in her path.